right. Today is Thursday. This will likely be streaming on a Friday. We'll see what happens. I don't know, but I am pre-recording this with Ryan, who has been ever so flexible despite the technical challenge we've had. My internet seems to insist it's unstable despite all my attempts to make it not unstable. But here we are. We're recording this out. We'll be streaming this when I am on paternity leave. But we're going to be talking about probably, I don't know. What do you think, Ryan? One of the most important things when it comes to leadership, conversations between a manager and a direct report.
I think it's fair. It's one of those really important things that everyone thinks they do really well, but always seems to bite you. And every once in a while you go, man, I'm really not that great at this.
Turns out I'm not actually that good at that. So we're going to talk about that. It's actually less about, even though it's learning tech talks, as anybody who's followed the show knows, it's not always about technology. And sometimes the key is getting back to the basics. So we're going to cover that. But before we do, we're going to get into some usual icebreaker type stuff because I know Ryan, we got to know each other. It's been a while now. We've been connected and talked for quite a while. Yeah. But not everybody might know you. So we'll get into that. And so let's start with this. Let's start with where you are. And you did tell me this before we went live because you've shifted around now and you're in a new location.
I have. Yeah, my family's actually moved around a lot in the past few years, and the pandemic really threw us for a whirl. So we likely a couple of years ago, I would have been in LA, and then we were in Cincinnati, Ohio. But I'm actually now in Highland, Utah. That's a pretty recent move for my family.
Okay. And how recent? When did you move there? Was it for the new role?
No, this was, the new role that I have is remote. So it was like, okay, we can still live anywhere. And this was actually for my kids' schooling. We've homeschooled for a while, but they're now in a private school that we really like the educational philosophy. So this was really recent. This was like 6 weeks ago. So what you don't see off camera is like still boxes piled. And so, but even though this movie looks put together, so.
Well, if it makes you feel any better, I've been in my house for about 3.5 years and we still have boxes sitting all over the place. So, nice. So you're in good company. You're in good company, Ryan.
Oh, good.
Okay. So, and you know what? I'm in Waukesha where I always am, joined by my friendly houseplant, Fred. And so let's get over to this because I actually made the icebreaker question tie pretty closely to the conversation. I normally don't do that, but every once in a while I'm like, you know what, this is going to be fun. So I'm looking forward to this story from you. I've got a couple myself. But Ryan, what is one of the most uncomfortable conversations you've had to have as a manager?
Yeah. Well, which one, right? There have been plenty of them. If you've been a manager for any time at all, I think you've had an uncomfortable conversation. For me, one of the most uncomfortable I had was actually one of the earliest when I was first a manager. So I, just after I graduated from my undergrad, I managed a nonprofit call center for a long time. So this had students working there. And one of the most uncomfortable conversations I ever had to have was firing someone. And it was really like obvious they were doing something wrong, but they claimed they weren't. But it was so hard. And it's because, so the good thing about this, I mean, typically when you're firing someone, it's easy not to have any conversations until something you're like, you got to go. This is awful. And we had some conversations like, hey, why, these numbers don't add up. What's going on here? Like this person called back in and said, you said this and what? And they, oh no, I'll change it. And so they were really well-intentioned. But things just kept going on. And so I had to bring this person into my office.
He just kept adding up.
Okay. Yep. And really say like, sorry, this isn't working. And it was just, I mean, it's emotional. It was someone who I was kind of friends, like I knew them for a long time. And it was just a disaster. It was hard because I thought, it seemed like the right decision. And I think looking back, it was, but man, it's so hard because it's while we'd love to pretend that performance is this binary thing, like, oh, it's just super clear what they're doing. It isn't, right? It's messy and hard.
Okay. All right. Well, that's a good one. That's a good one. And I think that'll lead to some really good discussion points in our conversation. So I have the advantage of thinking of these ahead of time. And I had a hard time with it because there was one that came to mind where somebody was fudging their expense reports and similar. I'm like, I know you're doing it, but I can't. It's really hard to prove because every time. So there was that. I've had a couple other ones where personal life was getting in the way of work, but it was important personal stuff. So I didn't want to say, Like that's not important, but
Yeah.
I had to have that performance conversation. But the one that I think was probably the hardest was I was with an org and they went through a massive riff and they didn't even tell direct managers their people had been riffed till the morning they got riffed. And so I got handed the list and said, you need to let these people know they're not going to be here. And it was the first I had even heard about it.
Ugh.
So for me, I had to sit down with these folks and have this conversation, but I had no context. I didn't know why they were picked. And of course, that's what people want to know when they're being like, oh, like, what's going on? Like, what happened? Did you? And I'm like, I don't have any answers to give to you other than these generic HR talk. It was awful because they're
awful.
crying and they're asking me why, how. And I'm like, I honestly don't know. So I was doing my best to have the company's intentions in mind and not sit and be like, wow, they're ridiculous type of a thing. But at the same time, recognize that this was messy. This was really messy and really yucky. That one's still, you get that feeling that your stomach just falls into your feet on those ones. And not fun.
That does not sound very fun at all.
No, it wasn't. It wasn't. Thankfully, that's only happened once. All right. So transitioning out of that, let's get a little bit into your background, because anybody who may know you or even checks out your LinkedIn, you've been at some big tech companies, and now you're in a new role you've been on the product side though. But when we first talked and you told me a little bit about what you were doing with Groove, I thought, hey, this is a really good topic of conversation. But before we get into that, how did you end up there, and what ended up making you go there? What's your background?
Yeah, so my background has kind of gone back and forth between talent and technology. So I started my undergrad, I did as a developer, computer science type major, and I thought, I'm just going to go code. I did a couple internships and found out very quickly, no, I want to head back more towards the people business side. And so I've kind of gone back and forth. I got a big break that I had. I did my MBA at Brigham Young University, and I was trying to decide what company to go to. And this little company that really hadn't recruited MBAs ever before showed up on campus called LinkedIn, and they were 1,500 employees at this point, and they just
tiny little company.
Well, and compared, I was getting, we were companies like Cisco and Procter and Gamble and Microsoft, and they were these huge companies, and then LinkedIn was like, yeah, we have 1,500 employees. And for me, what's funny is what attracted me to the company. Actually, they did an information session for students, and it was a disaster. It was a complete and utter mess. And I was like, I want to work at a place where I get to build stuff and actually change what's going on. I remember asking them, like, what are we going to be working on in the summer? And, these companies that had very rich programs, we have these projects and this, and and the LinkedIn person, I remember they were up there and they were like, I don't know, we're going to find whatever is our problem right then, and you're going to work on that. I was like, sold, let's do it. So I ended up going to LinkedIn in HR. And so I was HR business partner, working on career ladders. And this is when, Kelly Palmer, who I think you may know.
Yep, I know Kelly well.
She got hired as a new director of learning and development at LinkedIn. I got to know her, and because of my developer background, we ended up starting to collaborate on technology. That ended up becoming what we called Learn-In, this internal learning platform that was the seed of what today is LinkedIn Learning. So that's kind of where I really intersected with learning and cut my teeth there. Ended up going to Degree, doing a product role, but in an HR kind of tech company. Did some consulting then with a company called Sprintwell that I co-founded with a friend. And then, ended up starting Groove. Mostly for me, it's ironic because, I remember when I was in college, my wife was teasing me about this, as I mentioned I was going to be talking with you today. And she said, oh, it's a tech thing and you're going to talk about like non-tech stuff. And she said, oh, I remember when we were in college, I've always been a tech guy. And I remember saying like, there's going to be a day when I don't even have any paper in my whole house. it's all going to be digital and it's going to be great. And the irony is the older I get, the more I actually rely on paper more and more, because there's just something that's missing. I love technology and it's important. It's an important part of what we do and we have to have it, but it doesn't do everything. And we need to be clear about that. And so for me, I founded Groove because as I looked through my career and seen all of the things that happened at these learning and tech companies, I found that one of the most important things, this personal connection between managers and employees, and especially conversation, when you're looking each other in the eyes and talking, that technology more often than not got in the way of that. And it was like, man, how can we help people bring that back? And as I talk with people, this idea of helping managers have those conversations with confidence and teaching people how to have conversations, that sounds like such a stupid thing. Like, everyone knows how to have a conversation, but
but they don't.
But they don't. They really don't.
They do not.
And when you think about your marriage or partnerships that you have, you think about parents and kids talking and managers and employees, and it's like, yep, these do not go very well quite often. And so thinking about how do we equip, empower, and enable managers to be better able to show up and have the conversations, have confidence to know what to say. That to me was interesting, and why I started a company creating products and content and courses and things like that.
Okay. So we'll dig into this. We'll dig into this quite a bit, but it's funny that you bring that up, because I think this, I said this the other day in a talk where I was talking about the fact that we took for granted communication skills, and we have for a very long time.
Yeah.
And if anything, the last 18 months just shined a spotlight on the fact that we really are not as good at this as we'd like to think we are. Like, I'm a really good communicator. Or did you think you were because people were kind of around you and you said things to each other and you assumed that because nothing exploded that it must be working type of a thing. And suddenly now we've realized, turns out maybe it wasn't so great.
Yep. Totally agreed. I think for me, this is one of those interesting areas that I think can be most challenging, because there are some things that people know they're not good at, right? Like if you say Python coding development, like someone's like, oh, I have no idea.
I don't even know what that is.
But then there's other things. It's the things that, like, if you could go to college and take a class, and like, even if you really screwed up, like if it's a big English paper, like I could stay up all night and like pound out an English paper that's like a D type work, but I could get some credit. For me, when I took my computer science classes, like I couldn't even pretend to pound it out the night before. Like it literally wasn't possible, like, because we couldn't complete it. There are some of these skills that we have that we think we can do because we can kind of fudge it, and everyone's like, oh yeah, I know how to do that. It's these questions on LinkedIn. I saw one recently that said, how good of a listener are you? And well, you can imagine what that graph looked like. Everyone's like, oh yeah, I'm good. I'm really good at listening. Like we all think we're good at this thing. But the irony is we're actually not very good at it. And I think conversations are one of those things.
Okay. So I do have to ask this though, because I'm really curious. So you were in the text, and what's funny is this was a shared connection we had on this. Was similar to you. I thought programming was the way. I loved technology, was fascinated by it, and then learned I don't really like the building it side of it. I'm fascinated by it. I love what it's doing with people, but making it, not really my jam. But so you were in the space, and then you went down this path that was actually almost the polar opposite of tech. So I'm just curious, what kind of was the thing that made you go, I'm going to do this? Like, I'm actually going to, versus, because a lot of people have good ideas. They go, I think that maybe I could come up with this or that, or maybe I'll create this. And most of them never do anything with it. What made you go, I'm actually going to do something with it?
Yeah, part of it was that I've always loved, the conversations that I have, especially with students. I love mentoring and coaching people when it comes to career development, when it comes to getting promoted at work. For a lot of people, this is this black box that a lot of people don't understand. And so I've loved the conversations and things that I've learned and been able to teach people. So I was helping run a consulting company that helped teams understand how to adopt sprints as a mindset and as a practice, not just for designing things, but all the way from ideation through execution. And as we were teaching people and working with some pretty big companies doing this, we kept finding the same thing, which is managers are the linchpin to either making teams awesome or really causing problems at companies. So often we would be brought in to teach process and show people this new way. And we ended up in these big kind of group therapy sessions where teams really for the first time were like being honest. And it's like, we wanted to teach them like ways to sketch out process flows and do prototyping. And instead we ended up for like 6 hours in a room with everyone being like, I don't think we trust each other as a team. And let's talk about why that is and how we're doing that. And the manager's like, I've never realized this. And, we're kind of like, oh, you're paying us to do this. But like, and everyone's like, no, this is so valuable. We really need this. So that for us was interesting. We were coming in, I mean, we were a product innovation consulting firm, and yet we ended up talking about people skills and communication more than half the time. So that was an interesting insight. Yeah, it very interesting to me because, and one other piece, we started doing some agile architecture with companies going in because of my background as a product manager. We would help people understand, what is agile? How do you set that up? How do you execute that? And people think that agile is, oh, we just need to know the things and like do all the things. But it really, agile shines light on how you actually function as a team, what your leadership style is and what your mindset is. So because of all that, and because of some background I've had where for me, management has always been important. I remember working as a 16-year-old, my first job at a grocery store, and some shifts were awesome. And like the customers were happy, it went well, and other shifts sucked. And it was like, when do I get off? And I was like, what is so different? And it's because some managers I just loved working for. They were hardworking and kind. And some managers, you could just tell they did not care about you, and it was all about them. And
so you just wanted to go home.
So it was just like, man, it just made life harder. And so for me, I've seen that throughout my career. So all of that for me led to, man, I'd love to help solve this problem. So I started prototyping and thinking about ways to approach it, ran into some things that I saw that were working from other companies. Stanford was one, Instructure was another. They've had these card decks to help people have conversations. But I couldn't find one that you could purchase just to use yourself as a manager. These were for schools or as a part of a product. So that's kind of where it all started.
So then that goes to, because now Groove has been, we talked about the fact there's Groove and then you have this kind of sister spinoff side of it, but we've now talked about conceptually what it is. We might as well just articulate it for people, and you can actually show people too, because otherwise it's like Groove, manager conversations, have better. I get it, but like, what are we talking about here?
Yeah.
So how do you explain to people when you bump into people and you go, I founded a company called Groove, and they go, what does that do? What do you say?
I say the point of Groove is to help managers navigate critical conversations with confidence. There are these key conversations that managers need to have around typically career, performance, and skill development. And most managers aren't even aware that they need to have those, or if they are aware, they really don't know how. And when I start to say, HR always gives you some tools, and people's typical response is either laughter, like, oh yeah, they give us some tools, or to roll their eyes, like, yeah, that little sheet that, because people just aren't, they're like, yeah, I know I should. So I say, well, we're Groove is about thinking of ways to do this a little bit better and to make it appealing to individual managers and to individual employees. So the product that we've created is a card deck called Career Clarity. It's a deck of 54 words. These are values and motivators. And again, this isn't unique. There are card decks out there. A lot of them are for therapy. Stanford has a really great one that they've used for a long time. Instructure has one that they sell with Bridge. But so this is a card deck that it's a really simple card deck. It just has words like this one, trust. So, I mean, it's really, really simple. And there's an exercise that can be really fast, but it's ideally geared up for a 60-minute conversation to really dig into what matters in your career. So that's when you talk about Groove. There's other content and other things that we want to build, but this is right now the main product that we're putting in people's hands to have these conversations and these kind of self-reflective sessions with a physical item to help you actually move through that, which is very different than online survey, which we can talk more about.
Okay. Got it. So the ultimate goal behind it is to try and drive these conversations and to actually give managers a tool to be able to have them in an effective way. So that actually then, this is where we're gonna shift this. And again, hang on for the ride, Ryan, because I'm just gonna take this wherever we end up going with it.
Sounds good.
But we talk about the structure behind this, because I do agree with you that I think a lot of times there are very few leaders that I've talked to that probably would publicly say, oh, I don't care about that.
Yeah. It's an easy thing to care about. Yeah.
Some would, but most would say, no, I do care about that. But if you start peeling back the onion and say, well, do you have these conversations? Well, I mean to, I like to, I try to get to them, but sometimes we get distracted with other things. So I'm just curious, as you've dug deeper into this space and kind of explored this with other organizations, what are some of the things that you found really do make a difference? I mean, you obviously talked about structure, but I'm just curious your take on this.
Yeah, for me, some of the things that make a difference, I think there's two things that make a really big difference when it comes to the quality of conversations. I think number one is giving, putting employees in the driver's seat of these conversations. And that doesn't mean that it's it's the employee's responsibility to have them, because some managers or some companies are kind of like, oh yeah, career development. I mean, employees, if you want it, you bring it up. You do.
That's what I was going to see. I was seeing where you're going with that, because I've seen those managers that go, if you want to have those conversations, my calendar is up to date. Feel free to set them up for yourself, type of thing. And then when nobody does, they're like, well, see, not my problem.
For me, an interesting insight. I have a friend who was at DoorDash in HR, and this was a really interesting insight from him because he's one of the most coaching oriented people I know, just incredible career development. And as I was talking with him, he said, one of the hardest things that I have is I try to make time. I mean, I schedule, I tell people I want to talk about their careers. I go in, I sit down, and then, we start having this conversation. And especially younger employees, they tend to, I say, oh, great. How can I help you? What do you want to do? And they say like, I don't know. I mean, and so it becomes this like, I don't know, manager, you tell me what my career should be. And so then we default to career paths and kind of telling. So when I say putting the employee in the driver's seat, for me, one of the biggest things that I tell people is you need to give your employees a tool to think this through, ideally on their own first, and then with a manager. So I think that's number one. I think number two, and this is beyond the cards themselves, but number two is thinking about, well, what do we do with this? And for me, I'm going to say something that maybe is going to be unpopular. I don't think companies should be keeping track of everyone's career goals in aggregate. And that's going to, for a lot of companies, they're like, well, what? But the data, I want the data about that. The problem is it is nearly impossible when you start tracking in aggregate the goals of your employees, not to selfishly turn that into something you're tracking to make your company better. The secret of great career conversations is to say, employee, I genuinely care about you, and I want what you want. I want to know what you want, and I want to figure out how we align on that. And when you can get that type of feeling, it's amazing what can happen. And the stories that I hear from managers are going, wow, like I never knew this about my employee, and they shared it with me. And then I was like, guess what we could do? And it's where the intent is coming from matters. And that can be really difficult. And that's why a physical item, I think, is one of the best ways to open that up, because it can be very difficult to do otherwise.
So I'm going to go down both of these paths. I'm going to try and remember, and I'm going to see, where do I want to start with this? Because there's a lot of different directions I could go. Let's go with the first one. Your point of empowering the employer, kind of putting them in the driver's seat. I like the additional clarity you gave to that, because I've seen the pendulum swing way too far on either side of this. And the one example is what we gave before, where it's like, well, career development is on you. Your development is what you want it to be. So good luck. Check out the HR portal, and I'm here if you need anything. And honestly, I would say not even just young professionals. I've talked to people who, at very senior levels, when you say, what do you want to do? That they go, I don't know. I don't really know. I guess I haven't really thought about it, or I've just kind of gone wherever something else made sense, type of a thing. And it's not with the kind of intentionality you need. And so just tossing that to people and saying, do your thing and let me know if I can help you. You're basically leaving people, you're hanging them out to dry, because they don't even know where to start. But I think your point of, you can go the other way, which is, okay, so I've gotten to know you, and I think what you should do is this and this, and I'm going to set you up with these people, and they're going to talk to you, and I think your next job is this, and that's what that looks like. Some people, to be fair, I think some people would probably like their managers to do that. I think some people would. Right? It's better than nothing, and they would rather have somebody who's like, I really think this is what you should do, from an altruistic perspective, not I want you to do this because it makes my life easier, but more like, I really want what's best for you. But I think, to your point, that sweet spot is, let me help you do the work, but you have to do the work, because you're not going to be happy if you go do something that I told you to do, or that someone else told you to do, because even if you get into it, you're always going to be thinking, well, I'm here because so-and-so thought I should, and I don't really know.
Yep, exactly. I mean, most advice for me, it's interesting when you hear advice from people. And for me, some of the worst advice that you hear from people is, do what I did. which is hard because sometimes it can be good. Sometimes it can be, well, I found success this way. But for a lot of people, it's, well, this is what I did and I think I'm great, so you should do what I did. It's very different when you can say, look, here's what I've learned. Here's some trade-offs. Let's talk. I really want to, I mean, this is a real coaching conversation where you're drawing out of someone insight. You're helping them come to conclusions and learn. And the reality is most coaches are horrible managers, or sorry, most managers are horrible coaches. Coaching is hard. It's a really hard thing to do. Most
it's a skill.
Oh, it is definitely a skill. And so for most managers, so we have a manager guide that we ship with the card deck. And on level 1, like the instruction to managers, the number 1 tip that I can give for managers on how to be a better coach is to shut up and listen and to ask fewer questions, which seems, again, people are like, oh, what are the questions? And it's like, okay, no, if you haven't been trained as a coach, you're not going to have this incredible, amazing guided. You just need to say, oh, tell me more. Like, tell me more about that. Be quiet and listen and let people talk. For me, I think you also, the reason I think the Goldilocks approach, like having an employee who's empowered, but then led along, is so critical is because, and this comes from
Goldilocks approach.
Well, this comes from Bonnie Ware. She's the author of the 5 Regrets of the Dying. If you're familiar with that, this story makes its rounds on the internet every once in a while. The top regret of the dying, because she was a palliative nurse. She helped people at the end of their lives and asked people over and over, like, what's your biggest regret? And the number 1 regret that always came up was that people said, I wish I'd had the courage to live a life true to myself, not the life that other people expected of me. I think we can see that. I mean, with family, it's easy. Like, it's very easy to do what your parents wanted you to do and to live that life and just to kind of take a script and live it. And that's true at work too. It's so easy to do what is expected of you. It is hard and I think atypical for someone to really take time to go, what is important to me? What matters to me? Why am I doing what I do? And what do I want to do with that? And to have a manager who guides you through that type of thinking. I mean, that to me is one of the most amazing things on earth, to have anyone who does that. And I think managers are in this amazing position to guide people through that conversation. And without even, it's more about creating the space and the time than actually asking them a question. And so for me, that's a critical part. And when I talk about empowering employees, it's getting to that point of, okay, let's not just talk about what I want you to do, but let's give you time, space, and encouragement to actually talk about what you want, and then figure out what we're going to do about that.
Well, and what's interesting about that is it's a really good point in that there's a lot of things that go into creating the environment where people feel that they can do that. And I think sometimes we over-engineer it as a manager, where, like you said, it's like, okay, what are the 10 questions that I'm supposed to ask every quarter? And hopefully I can get, versus saying, well, what you're talking about, that environment, you have to build a serious level of trust with your employees where they know they can talk to you. If they don't trust you, you're not going to have that conversation. Whether you ask the magical questions or not, they're going to say what they think you want to hear so that they can get out of that office as quickly as possible, because this is awkward and uncomfortable. And I really don't trust you, Ryan, because I don't think what you're asking is coming from a good place, type of a thing. So if you don't have that environment, you're already dead to rights in terms of going down this path. And I think that's one of the things that, you know, is worth noting. I think the other thing that's something that probably is one of the silver linings that has come out of the last 18 months is those squishy feeling, kind of softer conversations in many organizations were kind of frowned upon. You know, it was kind of this taboo, you know, we don't talk about feelings and what aspirations and who you really are, because we're here to do a job. And I think that is starting to shift where it's like, well, but these are people we're dealing with, not robots. And we have to think about, look, if they're not engaged, if this isn't them living out what they really want to do, they're never going to bring their full selves to work, no matter what role we put them in.
Yep, exactly. The ROI on squishiness seems to be going up, right? That we say, well, I can't exactly measure this, but like we know that it has impact. So I agree that that's gone up. And to your point on the fact that, because some people I show this to, and I kind of talk about like, you know, what could be like, here's the ideal. And they just kind of sit back and go, well, wow, I don't, you know, and I don't even know if I'd be comfortable having that conversation with my manager. Like, ugh. And you say, that's, you know, here's the ideal. where you start is just by having it. It may not go well the first time. It may be clunky and awkward, and they may just say what you want to hear. But the way you start to get this culture is by creating space. And so for me, it's one of the most exciting things, because I think there's a couple of ways to use a deck like this. One is to give them to your managers and say, here, manager, go, and then you can use this and talk. And that's what a lot of manager training programs do. They give managers some deck of cards or something. As I go to companies, I actually encourage them to say, what you really want is not the managers to have this. You want the employees to have this. When an employee at their home opens up this box and says, wow, what is this? And there's a note that says, hey, we care about what you care about. This is a deck that will help you understand what's important, not just in your career, but in your life. And we'd love to use this at work. And we'd also love for you to use it. Some of the best conversations that happen with this that I hear about are actually between families, husbands and wives, partners sitting down and saying, well, what's important to us? Like, what really matters? And what are we going to do about that? And people say, like, wow, we've never I guess we've kind of
never had that conversation.
We've never had that conversation. Like, is this more important or this more important? And cards, something physical, forces you not just to be like, oh yeah, I don't know. But I mean, you're literally holding two cards and it's like, okay, well, which, red pill, blue pill kind of moment of like, which one's really important? And for me, it's not even the words you choose and the exact words. We could talk about how we got these words, and it's the words aren't actually that important. There's some better words, and we went through an exercise to find the best words, but being able
there's better words. I don't know the words.
They're better. Yeah. The good words. This is a good word. But for me, it's the time and just starting to think, which of these is more important? How do I define this word? What does this mean to me? Because it could mean lots of things. And then, so some people really want definitions with these. They're like, well, what is, like this accountability? What does that mean? And my favorite question is like, I don't know. What does that mean to you? Well, and then you start having this conversation about what things mean and getting shared definitions and then deciding, well, how important is this? And that space starts some really healthy conversations.
Okay. Well, and to your point of the discomfort of it, I think this is one of those areas that if you haven't gone down this path before, it is weird and uncomfortable. I mean, we even just talked about the conversations we had, our most uncomfortable conversations as managers. Oh. You're going to have them one way or the other, and you can either try and just avoid them, or you can lean into them and go, well, these are going to be kind of messy and sticky, but you know what? It's really coming from a good place, and we're going to hopefully get better at it. And I don't know what your experience has been, but from my perspective, what I've seen is people are really good at judging your intent. And you said this before, we talked about trust. So even if you screw it up and it doesn't go well and it's a hot mess, if people can tell, like, I'm actually really trying to do this because I care about your well-being and I'm trying to figure out how to get you there, most people can see past the messiness of it. Yep. And that even in and of itself can build trust. I even just think of your LinkedIn example from the very beginning of this, where part of what drew you to LinkedIn was the fact they're like, you know what? I don't really know what we would have you working on because we're kind of a mess. And that's actually why we're here. We want to invite you in to come help us figure that out. Like, the authenticity of that is magnetic.
Yes. And that, I love it. The authenticity. I mean, Brene Brown talks often about vulnerability as this kind of superpower at work. And, there's a lot of great stuff about that. For me, I think we are in a world where it's more difficult than ever to tell if something is authentic. You see, like, reviews online are so critical, and so many companies now know that. And so what do? They gain the reviews. Oh, they're sending things to people and trying to, so to be able to see reality is just something that we crave. And I think that's, for me, that's important, because one of the questions that comes up when managers say, okay, I'm going to jump into conversations, with the career clarity deck, or I'm going to have a performance conversation, talk about skill building. And the biggest worry is like, what if they ask a question I don't know? Because, you get in, and when there's this moment, because you're right, like, employees get there and, okay, what do you want to hear? And there's this moment when employees are like, are you serious? You really want to know what I think? And then like, well, okay, I want to get this job and I want to get promoted and my salary, and how can I, and managers are like, oh my word, I'm going to get all these questions and I won't know how to answer it. And they're like, what do I say? And I tell them, well, the best answer, the first thing you need to know is you need to say, that's a great question. I don't know the answer to that. Let me figure some things out and I'll get back to you. And then actually go and do that. Because I think it's okay for a manager to say, I don't know. And that's one of the biggest, HR is trying to enable managers to have all the answers, and it typically is a mess because there are a million questions and you can't know all the answers. And so just being honest and authentic of, Yeah, I don't know, but I'd love to help you figure that out. That is such a good place to say, hey, there's a manager who's actually going to do something for me. That can mean so much to people.
Well, and I think that point that you added on at the end, which is, and follow through with it,
Yeah.
right? Because
Yeah.
how often is it that you get the, yeah, I'll look into that for you. And then it's like, did you ever look in? Oh, no, I didn't. I didn't really.
Yeah.
Well,
Well,
now you've completely destroyed trust.
yeah. Well, this, I mean, for me, this is an answer. One way that we work with companies on this is to say, you do an engagement survey, and career development is typically something that scores low. And we say, this is an immediate answer. This isn't a pilot. Let's do software that we'll implement in 6 months and a year. And it's like, hey, you could get this in the hands of your employees in weeks after a survey to say, look, you said this wasn't going well. We're sending this out and having these conversations. But when I talk to people about employee surveys, I tell them, the worst thing a company can do actually isn't not to have an engagement survey. The worst thing you can do is have an engagement survey, get some results, and then do nothing. Because then it's like, great, you just asked us what sucks. We told you what sucked. And you were like, ooh, okay, we're going to let that keep sucking. Like, that's just it's not great. But a lot of, it's hard. It's so hard.
It is. But I think so. I even just think about it because we just went through. So we do quarterly ones, and I do. And to me, one of the most important questions I look at as a leader is, has this gotten better since the last time we did it?
Yeah.
Because to me, if we're not improving that point you just made, we're sending a clear message that it's like, we're opening the door, but we don't actually really care what you say because we're not going to do anything with it anyway, which then leads to people saying, well, wait, either what's the point? So I'm not going to contribute, or creates greater hostility where it's like, well, no, but you have to communicate this stuff out, I think is another point. So let me ask you this, because one of the other areas that we can oversimplify this and say part of being a manager is just asking a lot of good questions and going, interesting, tell me more, right? Like therapy, like just interesting.
Yeah.
There are times, and I'm sure you've been in this space, I know I have many times, where what someone wants or what they think, you go, I might have to give you some tough feedback on this, or I might have to actually say, I don't think you're where you think you are, or this is a development area that maybe you're not aware of. Now, that I think sometimes is one of the reasons managers steer clear of these.
Yeah, I do not want to have that conversation.
I don't want to have that conversation where I have to tell this person who thinks they're a shining star that, actually you've got some areas. So let's talk about that.
Let's talk about that, because if I could say, I've got a card deck that'll make that super easy, like I'd be rich and we could all go home and everyone's problem would be solved. Because like, you're right. Having to deliver tough feedback is never fun. It's something that I think you have to learn. It's something that a lot of senior people have gotten better at over time. But it's why for me, the book Radical Candor is is one great data point. There's some things I don't necessarily agree with about the approach and how some people take radical candor and turn it into,
some people take radical candor and think that means that you can just be a complete jerk and then write it off. It's like, I'm just being candid.
Yeah. If you actually listen to Kim Scott, it's like, no, it's like, radical compassion actually would maybe be a better way to put, and I think the actual methodology, it's for me, it's always funny to learn about methodologies because then you'll inevitably find someone who's like, that methodology sucks. This is what you should really do. And they describe what the original author of the methodology says you should do, but people always screw it up. But for those hard conversations, it's hard because there's just no way around it. I remember I had a boss who once told, so I was almost in a situation like you said earlier, where I got promoted. Somebody said, hey, you're going to manage this team now. And on the same day they said, oh, and we're letting 2 team members go. And I was at first was like, you're going to make me fire 2 of my peer team members that I now manage. And thankfully they were, more compassionate, said, look, I'll handle those because, I was managing the team before. But when that person, when they said they're going to fire, and they said, well, firing, no one ever knows it's coming. It's always a mess. And like, you just got to lay it on and move on. And I was like, well, sure, if you don't give them feedback along the way, then they don't know it's coming. And it's so hard to give that feedback. So many HR conversations are, oh, this person's not performing. We need to fire them. And HR is like, okay, what documentation do you have? Have you talked to them? Well, they know, they should know that they're really not doing it. Like everyone knows, we all talk about it all the time, but inevitably, because we try to avoid sharing that hard feedback. So for me, I haven't found a silver bullet yet. You've just got to practice and get good at being honest and open. For me, the one thing that helps is following up with a measure of charity and love, which are maybe weird words to use at work. But if someone senses you don't care about them, feedback is never going to go well. But if you can say, look, I care about you as a person, and this is why the impact of this, I think that can go better than if you're just saying, well, I don't like you or you're in my way. Because it's so easy to be selfish as a manager and just say, you need to change because this is annoying me. Same thing as a parent, right? We tend to get mad at our kids at times because they're inconveniencing us, making us look bad. It's like so often if I really
I have no idea what you're talking about.
I mean,
Brian.
I know
I've
you're
never,
a perfect parent,
I have never done that.
Maybe it's just me, but it's just so hard to come from that altruistic place where it's driven by love and caring for other people. And I think if we use more of that, again, that's not always a popular term at work with managers, but I think it's needed to make those conversations go better.
Well, and I think you hit on a couple things that get back at this, which is sometimes I think this is true of a lot of things in life where we try and avoid them and hope that maybe it'll just never blow up. But it does. It's like, well, you know, maybe if I don't ever step on the scale, I won't actually gain weight. And then you finally do one day and you go, oh my word, like, how did I let this get so far away from me? And I think the same is true with relationships with employees where, I don't really want to have this awkward conversation because they're not really doing maybe I just won't, I'll just kind of like kick it down the curb and hope something happens. Maybe they'll quit, type of a thing. And it doesn't work that way versus if you have those regular, consistent conversations. Getting back to your point, if they don't feel you care, it is true. No matter what you do, it's not going to go well because it's just going to be apparent. And the less time you spend on this, the harder it is to convince people that you actually do care. Because it's like, well, if you cared, maybe you would have had this conversation with me a year ago instead of waiting until now to fire me over it, type of a thing.
Yep. Totally agree. And this for me, so there's an equation that I really like that I think explains some of this as well. It's called a trust equation. It comes from a book methodology called The Trusted Advisor. And because trust is kind of this nebulous, like, what's trust? Chris, we trust each other. Yeah, we're good. And people say, or like a team, like our team has trust, but they break it down to 4 different elements. There's 3 on the top that increase trust. There's 1 on the bottom, the denominator, that decreases trust. So the 3 elements that increase trust are credibility, reliability, and intimacy. So credibility.
I've seen this equation.
You've seen it. Yeah. So credibility. You're an expert, like, what you're talking about. Reliability, you actually do what you say you'll do, which, like you said earlier, that's a key piece. Like if I say I'm going to ask a question, follow up, I got to go do it. And intimacy, which isn't usually a word we use at work, but, do we actually know each other? Do we know each other as people? Do we connect? And then the bottom of the equation is or perceived self-orientation. So it's this idea of, are you doing things just because you want them and they're going to benefit you? Then it doesn't matter what you're doing on the top.
Right. You could have all that. Everybody knows if you divide by 0.
Yep. And that gets to these hard conversations, and the problem is usually people have not built trust. They're either not reliable, they haven't been intimate or shown that they even care about you or your family or anything about you. And they're doing things that are in their self-interest. And so then when you have to have a hard conversation, it just makes it all that much more difficult. But if you've been having conversations that build trust over time, when you do have something hard, you have this place to draw from to say, well, look, this person's they've invested in me, like, man, maybe they're not such a jerk after all. So for me, the key to having those hard conversations isn't some, tricky, like, here's how it's like, nope. The key is long before that conversation. Have you had regular conversations that are not selfish conversations, that are actually helpful, where you've shown competence, where you've been reliable, where you've built a relationship, and then it's easier to give that feedback.
Okay. Well, and I think it's important to note that ultimately there is a chance that it is going to go south no matter what you do. And I think that's just one of the hard realities of being a people leader, because going back to, and I do remember that trust equation now, but it's true. And it's important to do those things, even though you might be like, well, but it might go south anyway. And it's like, well, but just because it might go south doesn't mean that you don't do any of these other things. Just because you might have a heart attack doesn't mean that you don't exercise and take care of yourself. in life and go, well, I'm just going to throw caution to the wind because it could go south anyway. Because it's like, well, you dramatically reduce the probability or likelihood of that happening. But I mean, I remember the conversation I had with somebody where it was like, I have fudged expense reports right here. I don't know who did that. This is outrageous. And you're like, okay.
It's not going to go well no matter what, right? They're not going to be like, yeah, okay. Like, no. It's going to be sorry, security, please come and help. There's no way around it. And
it's not going to be pretty.
No, and I think that's just part of being a manager as well. As there's this amazing potential for managers. Clayton Christensen has this quote I love where he says, management is one of the most noble of professions, that you have this ability to help people and improve the world. But at the same time, it's messy and there's going to be hard things. And that's just part of being a manager sometimes as well.
Right. Well, and I was going to see where you were going with it, but I was thinking, the Peter Parker principle kind of applies with great, responsibility. With great power comes great responsibility. But I think the other point that you hit on, and it actually goes back to this trust equation with perceived self-interest on the bottom is, that whole side of, sometimes people have this perception that being in a leadership role it's about you and the what you can do and the glory or the power that you get out of it, versus saying, actually, no, being a great leader is actually quite the opposite. You're actually there to serve the needs of the people who, at least if you want it to work well, I mean, you can be a power monger, but it's probably not going to go very well.
It's one of the most difficult parts of managing because, servant leadership, this cliche term like, oh yeah, I'm going to be a servant. But as you get power, it's just part of being human that, okay, I want to protect that power and I want to get more of it. And so what do? We start building kingdoms. We start, doing what's interesting for us. And so being able to have this value of being giving and selfless and humble, these are incredible leadership attributes at work. But that'd be weird to show up at management training. We're going to talk about being humble today, and but because typically those who are getting into leadership positions have ambition. It takes a ton of hard work, and there are other characteristics that are different that you need to have as a leader. But being able to really show people that you care about them, for me, is one of the great keys of leadership.
Well, and I think it gets to I think sometimes part of the problem I've seen is people look at it as a zero-sum game. Where, if I give up something to, take care of, or I'm somehow losing. And really what I've found from a people leadership standpoint is it's quite the opposite. It's almost like the more you give up, the more you get back, and so in many regards, it doesn't work like a nice math equation. Well, if I move some things from this side of the scale tips. It's like, weirdly, it's quite the opposite. You move things over here and the scales don't seem to move the way you'd expect.
Yes, totally agree. It makes me think. So there's this kids book. I just looked it up. It's called How Full Is Your Bucket for Kids. Okay. This is out of Gallup, some of the research that they've done. And it's this little kids book where they say everyone walks around with this little bucket of water on top of their head, like floating above their head. And you would think that the way to fill up your bucket is to take from other people's buckets. Like, oh, they've got water, I'm going to take. So bucket dipping. But the secret of the bucket is when you fill someone else's bucket, your bucket fills up too. And so it's this interesting book that teaches this concept. And again, what's silly, I've thought about starting a YouTube series where I read children's books and then talk about how business leaders need to learn from them. Because I think so many business leaders need these little kindergarten lessons. But this is one where, hey, if you want to have influence and help other people around you, figure out how you can help other business units and other teams and give of your time. And again, you got to balance that with things you need to do. You shouldn't just go around all day helping out, you should be responsible for what you're doing. But there's a place for, again, this charity, this hey, I'm going to go and help. And what can I do for others? That builds incredible relationships, which can increase trust and make incredible things happen when it comes to your business and the results that you want to drive.
And on that one, because I like that illustration because it goes back to this whole point. We often think of it as a zero sum. Like, well, if I take water from that's the only way I get more water, versus the opposite is, well, if I take water out of mine and put it somewhere else, magically it fills up, type of a thing. Yep. But that goes to some other tough conversations, which is a bit of a mindset shift from a leadership standpoint. Because when you think about some of these career conversations, I've had conversations with leaders where they go, well, what if somebody on my team wants to do something that's not on my team or not at this company?
Yeah, it's
And
scary.
it's like, then that's okay. Then you can have that conversation. And we say, I mean, one of the best experiences I had with a direct report was he came to me and we'd built the trust, but he said, I want to go work for Google. And he was my best performer. And I remember going, whoa, okay. But we went with it and we said, well, if that's really what you want to do, like, then let's figure this out. And actually, it was one of the smoothest transitions that I think I've ever had as a leader, because this individual was so energized by the fact that he had my support to support what he was doing. He planned his whole transition. He did a long stay in between the job switch. I mean, it was amazing. And then he called a year later and goes, it turns out I really don't like working at Google. I don't think this is actually where you warned me of this, but I didn't listen at the time. And he came back. So it was one of those things where I think sometimes, again, that idea of stop hoarding, stop thinking that that's the secret to growing your king. It's not. It's not. You're looking at it fundamentally wrong.
Yeah. Well, and I like that you bring up the math. Like, this is a math equation that doesn't make sense. And so we need to fight our basic human nature, you know, the hunter gatherer kind of base part of our brain that says, ooh, get what I can and keep it. Nope. In a community, it is about being able to be giving. And like you, for me, it's amazing how many stories I've heard like that, where managers who go, you know, let's invest in you. Like, let's do something that maybe isn't best short-term for my team. But when you become known as the team that cares, the team that helps people get to great things, the leader that invests in people, like, you cannot replicate that any other way. So to be able to become that type of leader, I think is critical. And that is at the heart for me of this career conversation. That's so critical. There's a book that Reid Hoffman. So when I was at LinkedIn, he published a book called The Alliance. And what I really like about it, so The Alliance talks about a new approach to how employees and companies actually kind of make an agreement. Because he said, oh, some companies, you know, an employee shows up at a company and, you know, you recruit them, and then day one, and they're like, oh, you're like family. This is awesome. We all love it. Woo! And then they're like, and then, you know, they sit down, and at some point during onboarding, they slide a piece of paper across the table and say, hey, by the way, we're an Atwell company and we can fire you at any time for any reason. And like, hey, just so you know, thanks. And it's like, well, wait a second, you know, these are like different messages. So his comparison is work is more like sports teams, where it has to be in the interest of the player, has to be in the interest of the team. And if at any time it isn't working for one of them, that's okay. You can move on. And so creating these tours of duty that are beneficial to both parties, because the reality is your employees are going to leave, and hoarding them and making it hard for them to leave doesn't help the problem. And in fact, probably makes it worse. And so being able to say, look, let's be honest about what you want is the key to getting a truly engaged workforce, where people are bringing their whole selves to work. They're bringing their ideas, they're bringing their passion. They're going to work longer for you and more for you and be excited, because they know that there's some authenticity about this, and that you actually care about them. And so then they'll invest in you and the team.
You know, as you bring that up, I think it brings up an interesting point that a lot of times, and it's interesting. Nick Shackleton Jones wrote about this in his book, and he talks about the fact he was running a leadership session once, and at one point, one of the leaders in the session said, "Well, that's not how my parents would have done it." And he said it was a really interesting insight that a lot of times people model their leadership style after their parents. And there's two major issues if you don't address that. First of all, one, we all come from dysfunctional families, right? Everybody's got dysfunction in their family. So the reality is you're basing this off of a broken premise anyway. There's dysfunction that's, you know, seeded into that. But then on top of it, the relationship of a parent-child is very different than leader direct report. That is so different. And I think that's one of the things that when you get to some of this, you almost have to take a step back and go, well, wait a minute, how am I operating and how am I making decisions? Because quite frankly, I may be making these completely wrong. Like, my employees are not my children. I'm not here to tell them what to do. And that is not that, even if that's the model that I'm basing my leadership style off of, which actually adds a whole lot of complexity. Maybe we should have made this learning therapy sessions or something like that on it, because I think a lot of these things are important to dig into when we talk about leaders leading teams, and where are they basing some of this, and how are they actually coming to these conclusions? Because a lot of it doesn't make sense if we compare it to our family dynamics, or if we compare it to a math equation where, well, 1 plus 2 equals 2 and 2 minus 1 equals 1. Well, not in leadership. 1 minus 1 equals 4. Well, that doesn't make sense to me.
It doesn't. And I think for me, one model that, and I use this in my family as well as when I coach and work with people and manage teams at work, the idea of the stories we tell ourselves is so critical at work. And I mean, we talk about this somewhat with wellness type stuff and, you know, the things we think, but to realize that, one, we always have a voice in our head, and it talks really fast. And it's telling us things all the time. Right. And it's the thing, when you first meet someone, you're telling yourself stories of like, who is this person? And are they going to help me or hurt me? Or, you know, what are they? Are they competent or not? And we tend to bucket people and kind of tell a story about them really fast. And so we have stories about all sorts of things, about how we show up at work, about people's intentions, about what's good and bad and what we like and don't like. And so like that example with that guy who said, oh, that's not how my parents would have done it. Like, well, he's got a story in his head about what leadership is and what's good about that and what's bad about that. Becoming aware of the story in your head, deciding what that means for you, of like, do I like this? Do I not like this? And then taking some action moving forward is so powerful. And not just at work, but in your personal life. I mean, for me, like a story that I grew up with that I've learned like was a story, was about the way I saw money. I saw money as like, oh, the stories in my head about money were like, there's not enough and you got to save it and you should never spend it. And it makes sense, like given where some of my parents came from, some of the experiences they had. And it's like, oh, this is something in my family that's a story we've passed down. That's different than my wife's story about money. And we've had to kind of come to grips with like, what is our story? And then it's like, well, we can do whatever we want. Like we can have any story we want about money and how, and at work then to realize, well, the story I tell about people's intentions, about how to lead, about what's good or bad, about how to handle dysfunction on a team, how to handle employees who fudge expense reports. And, you know, you get to decide how you handle that and what story you're telling yourself about each one of those things. And so often we just accept the default story that we've been programmed with from a child, and we don't actually stop and think. And again, for me, coming back to the card deck, the card deck doesn't matter. You know, like if that helps people, sure, you can buy it on my website. You can do that. But for me, the most important thing is carve out some time, stop. And I encourage people to turn off technology, because technology just distracts us all over, and like take time to actually say, what am I thinking? What's my story? What do I want it to be? Let's make that visible in some way, write it down, and then decide like, well, I can change this story. And that can change everything, because the culture we have at work, the habits we use personally, all come from these stories that we tell ourselves. And it's critical to understand, what are those stories and what do I want them to be? And for me, that's a lot of leadership, is helping people understand, well, what's the story? What's the story of our team? And then what are we going to do about that?
And when you think about it in that sense, it goes back to what you said early on in this conversation, that there is so much opportunity to have such a positive impact on your teams, your organizations, people's lives. I mean, you really can have a dramatic impact. And we've seen that over the last 18 months, that how well somebody's work environment and their leader, what that relationship and dynamic can either help people thrive through times of just chaos, or it can leave them out to dry in, an environment where they should be totally fine. And I think that's one of the things where there is a tremendous responsibility, and it's in some ways harder than we realize. And in some ways it's a lot easier than we make it out to be.
Yep. Yeah. That is for me, the paradox of it, that it's really not hard. Just sit down and have a conversation with someone. Like, this is not complicated stuff. But sometimes it's scary and we get out of a habit of it. And then we go along and suddenly we have to fire someone that we've never had a real had an honest conversation about what's going wrong. And not
because you just found out the day before, or you just got moved into that position.
That's right. That's right. No, you let things go too long. I mean, to be able to have courage to say what you really want to say, I think is an important thing. And so for me, being able to figure out how do I do that? And what are the tools that I can use to better express myself, to think clearly about what I want, and then tell other people about that. I think that has tremendous impact on our workplace and can help any team to function better and better figure out what are the goals we should have. How do we accomplish those goals? And I think it ties to business results, even though it can be kind of squishy stuff.
Well, we could probably just keep going. I could probably just keep recording, but we'll run out of time and we'd lose our audience if we kept going too far. But I think we hit on some of the really big ones, and I really love what you've done with it, with Groove, to just, again, try and equip people and managers with the tools to be able to do this. Because while ultimately you can lead a horse to water, you can't make it drink. There are things we can do to hopefully get them closer to the water to be able to do that. So thank you for making the time. Thanks everybody for watching and listening. This was an absolute blast, and always good to see you, Ryan.
Yep, you too. Thanks.